Have you ever wondered if the God we worship today is really the first God humanity ever knew? Long before Yahweh became the central deity of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there existed powerful gods. Gods whose stories, rituals, and wisdom were deliberately hidden from history. These were not minor figures lost in time. They were revered, feared, and deeply integrated into the spiritual and cultural lives of ancient African civilizations. Yet, the memory of these gods was systematically erased. The Church, wielding its authority, sought to replace the divine knowledge of our ancestors with a singular narrative, a narrative that would eventually become the foundation of mainstream religion. Imagine scrolls burned, temples destroyed, rituals suppressed, and generations growing up without knowing the truths of their own heritage. The hidden God. Before Yahweh is not just a story of a forgotten deity. It is a story of power, control, and spiritual censorship. For centuries, entire civilizations' connections to their divine origins were intentionally severed. And yet, fragments remain, symbols, myths, and echoes of worship that still pulse beneath the surface, waiting to be rediscovered. In this video, we will take you on a journey through time, uncovering the hidden gods who came before Yahweh, the tactics used to erase them, and why these revelations matter to us today. By the end, you'll start questioning not only history as it's written, but also the spiritual legacy you thought you knew. This is more than history. It's an awakening, a chance to reconnect with truths long buried and challenge the story that was handed down. Get ready to uncover the hidden God before Yahweh and see the divine past that the Church tried so desperately to erase. Long before Yahweh became the central figure in monotheistic religions, there existed powerful gods and deities who shaped the spiritual lives of ancient African civilizations. These were not mere mythological figures. They were living embodiments of divine wisdom, justice, creation, and cosmic balance. The hidden God, in particular, occupied a sacred space in the hearts and minds of the people, revered for guiding communities, overseeing natural and moral order, and connecting humanity to the cosmos. This deity was often represented in intricate statues, sacred symbols, and ceremonial rituals, reflecting a profound understanding of life, death, and the eternal cycle of creation. But who exactly was this hidden God? Historical fragments suggest that this deity may have been associated with creation, justice, and the life-giving forces of nature, roles that were later partially absorbed or reinterpreted by other religions. From the fertile banks of the Nile to the kingdoms of Nubia and Kush, the hidden God was central to governance, morality, and cultural identity. Priests, scholars, and community leaders acted as intermediaries, translating divine guidance into daily life, festivals, and laws. Temples dedicated to the hidden God were hubs of knowledge, art, and spiritual practice, making the deity not only a divine presence but also a cultural cornerstone. The reverence for this hidden God, however, made it a target for emerging religious authorities. As the Church expanded its influence, narratives around older African deities were suppressed, demonized, or deliberately erased. The hidden God, once celebrated openly, became forbidden knowledge, whispered only in secret among the initiated. Sacred texts were destroyed, temples dismantled, and rituals banned, severing the connection between people and their ancestral divinity. Understanding the hidden God is more than rediscovering a forgotten name. It is reclaiming a lost chapter of human spiritual history. This deity represents a time when spirituality was intimately tied to culture, nature, and community, a holistic approach to divinity that the Church's narratives sought to replace. By exploring who the hidden God was, we begin to grasp not only the richness of ancient African religions but also the deliberate ways history has been rewritten, leaving generations unaware of the gods that came before Yahweh. To truly understand the hidden God before Yahweh, we must journey back thousands of years to the heart of ancient African civilizations, Nubia, Kush, and Egypt, where spirituality and daily life were inseparable. In these societies, gods were not distant or abstract. They were living forces, shaping the seasons, guiding kings, and governing morality. Temples, statues, and sacred texts bore witness to a deep, sophisticated understanding of the universe, revealing a pantheon of deities that reflected the complexities of human existence and cosmic order. The hidden god occupied a central place among these divinities, revered not just for spiritual guidance but also as a symbol of justice, creation, and communal balance. At the time, religious practice was profoundly integrated with governance, law, and education. Priests acted as intermediaries between the divine and the people, preserving sacred knowledge, performing rituals, and advising rulers. Festivals, rituals, and symbols were designed to maintain harmony between the natural and supernatural worlds. This god's influence extended into every aspect of life, from agriculture to justice to moral instruction, making the deity indispensable to society's survival and prosperity. However, as external powers began to assert influence over the region, the spiritual landscape started to shift. The rise of monotheistic faiths and the eventual spread of the Church's authority brought a deliberate campaign to suppress pre-existing beliefs. Sacred texts were destroyed, temples were dismantled, and rituals were banned or demonized. The cultural and spiritual framework that had sustained these civilizations for centuries was systematically replaced with a singular narrative centered around Yahweh, leaving little trace of the older gods in public memory. This historical context is crucial because it illustrates how the hidden god's disappearance was not accidental. It was part of a calculated effort to erase spiritual traditions and consolidate religious authority. By understanding the rich cultural backdrop in which the hidden god was worshipped, we can appreciate not only the depth of ancient African spirituality, but also the enormity of what was lost. It also challenges the common perception that monotheistic religions emerged in a vacuum. Instead, they often built upon, absorbed, or deliberately suppressed earlier beliefs. Examining this period allows us to see beyond what history textbooks teach, reconnecting with a forgotten spiritual heritage and recognizing the hidden God as a vital link between humanity and the divine forces that shaped civilizations long before Yahweh became the singular focus of worship. Africa has long been the cradle of civilization, and nowhere is this more evident than in the ancient kingdoms of Nubia, Kush, and Egypt. These civilizations were not only political and cultural powerhouses, but also spiritual epicenters, where religion and daily life were inseparable. Temples, pyramids, and sacred monuments rose across the lands, dedicated to a rich pantheon of gods, including deities whose memory has been largely erased from modern history. The hidden god, central to many of these cultures, played a pivotal role in guiding communities, ensuring justice, and maintaining cosmic balance. In Egypt, gods like Amun-Ra, Isis, Osiris, and Ptah were revered. Yet beneath the layers of mythology lay deeper spiritual truths often connected to a deity whose influence predates Yahweh. Similarly, in Nubia and Kush, rulers and priests upheld intricate religious practices that honored divine forces governing creation, fertility, and morality. These civilizations recognized the divine in every aspect of life, from the flow of the Nile to the cycles of the moon, integrating spirituality with governance, law, and art. Temples were centers of learning, healing, and ritual, preserving sacred knowledge passed down through generations. The spiritual practices of Nubia, Kush, and Egypt were interconnected, creating a shared foundation of faith across vast regions of Africa. Festivals, offerings, and ceremonies were not just symbolic. They were expressions of community, responsibility, and connection to the divine. priests acted as intermediaries, conveying messages from the gods and guiding people in matters of justice, health, and morality. Through these systems, the hidden god maintained a tangible presence in society, reinforcing the idea that divinity was accessible and deeply woven into everyday life. Yet, the rise of external powers and the spread of monotheistic religions disrupted these vibrant spiritual landscapes. The church and later colonial forces actively suppressed indigenous African religions, erasing temples, burning texts, and silencing rituals. Despite these attempts, echoes of the ancient gods survive, in myths, symbols, and cultural practices that persist even today. Understanding Nubia, Kush, and Egypt as cradles of faith allows us to see the depth of African spirituality and recognize the hidden god as more than a forgotten deity. These civilizations remind us that religion, culture, and knowledge were once inseparable, and that the spiritual heritage of Africa is both ancient and profoundly influential, offering insights into the divine truths that came before Yahweh. Long before external influences reshaped the spiritual landscape, African spirituality was a holistic system that united body, soul, and nature into a single, harmonious existence. Every action, every ritual, and every aspect of daily life was infused with spiritual meaning. People did not see themselves as separate from the land, the rivers, or the sky. They understood that their well-being was intrinsically connected to the health of the natural world and the balance of the cosmos. The hidden god, along with other deities, played a central role in maintaining this equilibrium, guiding individuals and communities through the cycles of life, fertility, and morality. Spiritual practices were not limited to temples or ceremonial spaces. They permeated agriculture, governance, healing, and art. Priests, elders, and spiritual leaders acted as mediators between humans and the divine, interpreting signs from the gods, teaching moral principles, and preserving sacred knowledge. Music, dance, and storytelling were sacred acts, channels for connecting the living with ancestors and divine forces. Nature itself, trees, rivers, mountains, and the stars, was imbued with spiritual significance, each element a reflection of the divine order. Central to this worldview was the understanding that humans are not merely physical beings but multidimensional, body, soul, and spirit interconnected, each influencing the other. Rituals often incorporated physical actions, symbolic objects, and spiritual intentions simultaneously, reinforcing the unity of existence. Healing practices, for example, combined herbal medicine, prayer, and ancestral invocation, demonstrating a sophisticated integration of physical and metaphysical knowledge. This holistic spirituality fostered a profound respect for life, community, and the environment. It emphasized responsibility, harmony, and the interconnectedness of all living things, teaching that imbalance in one area, whether moral, environmental, or social, could ripple through the entire system. Understanding African spirituality before colonization allows us to recognize the depth and sophistication of these belief systems. The hidden god and other deities were not distant entities, but active, guiding forces within a living, breathing ecosystem of culture and nature. By reconnecting with this knowledge, we can appreciate a spiritual heritage that celebrates unity, balance, and the sacred interdependence of body, soul, and the natural world, a perspective that modern society is only beginning to rediscover. The Bible, as we know it today, is often seen as a purely monotheistic text, but a closer look at history reveals intriguing connections to ancient Egyptian beliefs. Long before Yahweh became the central figure of worship, African civilizations had developed rich mythologies, intricate rituals, and complex theologies centered around powerful deities. Many of these ideas, creation, divine justice, resurrection, and moral guidance, find echoes in biblical narratives, suggesting that the spiritual legacy of Egypt influenced early religious thought in profound ways. Consider Osiris, the Egyptian god of resurrection and the afterlife. His story of death and rebirth, moral judgment, and promise of eternal life mirrors certain biblical concepts of salvation and resurrection. Similarly, Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice, embodies ethical principles that resonate with the commandments and moral laws emphasized in the Bible. Amun-Ra, as the life-giving sun deity, symbolizes divine authority and omnipresence, traits later associated with Yahweh. These parallels do not suggest direct copying, but rather a transfer and transformation of spiritual archetypes over time. Historical interactions, through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange, allowed Egyptian religious ideas to travel beyond the Nile. Hebrews and other ancient peoples came into contact with Egyptian spiritual traditions, adopting, adapting, or reinterpreting elements to fit new monotheistic frameworks. Over centuries, as the Church consolidated power, these connections were often downplayed or erased, framing biblical teachings as entirely original while suppressing their African roots. Understanding these hidden links challenges the perception of a spiritual vacuum before Yahweh. It highlights how the principles of justice, morality, and divine governance were already explored in depth by civilizations like Egypt, offering a richer, more interconnected view of humanity's spiritual evolution. Recognizing these connections does not diminish the Bible. Rather, it reveals a continuum of human effort to understand the divine, showing that the hidden God and ancient African deities were integral to shaping the foundations of spiritual knowledge that would later appear in written scripture. By exploring these links, we begin to see the Bible not just as a religious text, but as a chapter in a much larger story, one where African gods and spiritual wisdom provided the scaffolding for beliefs that would eventually shape global religious thought. Long before Yahweh became the central deity in monotheistic religions, African societies revered powerful fertility goddesses who embodied life, creation, and the cycles of nature. These goddesses were central to communities, overseeing birth, harvest, and the harmonious balance between humans and the natural world. They represented not only physical fertility, but also spiritual abundance, guiding people in moral, cultural, and ritual practices that ensured the continuity of life and society. As monotheistic religions expanded, the Church undertook a deliberate campaign to suppress these goddesses. Temples were destroyed, rituals banned, and myths recast as pagan superstition. Over time, the nurturing, life-giving powers of these goddesses were absorbed, reinterpreted, or replaced by a singular male deity, Yahweh. This transformation was not merely religious, it was political and cultural. By replacing multiple deities with a singular god, the Church consolidated spiritual authority, erasing the matriarchal and nature-centered traditions that had guided African civilizations for centuries. The Great Substitution illustrates more than religious change. It reflects a systematic erasure of spiritual memory. Communities once deeply connected to fertility, cycles of nature, and female divine power were forced to adopt doctrines that often contradicted their ancestral wisdom. This shift altered not only religious practices, but also cultural identity, moral values, and the ways societies related to nature and the cosmos. Understanding this substitution is crucial to reclaiming the spiritual heritage of African civilizations. It highlights how the nurturing, life-affirming deities of the past were intentionally erased, and how modern interpretations of divinity often obscure these ancient truths. By studying the fertility goddesses and their transformation into Yahweh's narrative, we begin to see the patterns of spiritual suppression, cultural loss, and the deliberate rewriting of human connection to the divine. The rise of the Church marked a turning point in the spiritual history of Africa. As Christianity expanded its reach, it systematically intervened in the religious practices of African civilizations, seeking to replace indigenous beliefs with a singular, centralized theology. Temples were destroyed, sacred texts were burned, and rituals that had guided communities for centuries were forbidden. Priests and spiritual leaders, who once acted as intermediaries between humans and the divine, were marginalized or persecuted. This intervention was not merely spiritual, it was deeply political, consolidating power under a new religious authority, while severing people from their ancestral gods and knowledge. The Church's efforts were strategic and pervasive. Symbols, myths, and oral histories of the hidden god and other deities were recast as pagan superstition or demonized entirely. Sacred practices tied to fertility, creation, justice, and ancestral veneration were reinterpreted or erased, effectively rewriting the cultural and spiritual memory of entire societies. Communities that had once thrived under a holistic, interconnected spiritual framework were forced to adopt doctrines that often conflicted with their lived experiences and natural cycles. This intervention reshaped not only faith, but also identity. By imposing a singular divine narrative, the Church undermined matriarchal and nature-centered traditions, privileging male-centric theology over the previously revered goddesses and holistic deities. The result was a profound loss of spiritual continuity, cultural knowledge, and ancestral wisdom. Understanding Church intervention allows us to see the deliberate mechanisms behind the erasure of African spirituality. It highlights how power, politics, and religion were intertwined, showing that the suppression of the hidden god and other deities was intentional, not accidental. Recognizing this history is crucial to reclaiming the voices and traditions that were silenced, and to appreciating the depth, complexity, and resilience of African spiritual heritage. The systematic erasure of African spiritual traditions had profound and lasting effects on communities, culture, and identity. When the Church and colonial powers suppressed indigenous beliefs, destroyed temples, and banned rituals, they did more than eliminate religious practices. They severed connections to ancestral wisdom, communal cohesion, and a holistic understanding of life. Generations grew up disconnected from the deities, symbols, and teachings that once guided morality, justice, and harmony with nature. The hidden god and other African deities became forbidden knowledge, leaving a spiritual vacuum that altered both personal and collective identity. This erasure reshaped cultural memory. Oral histories, myths, and sacred practices were lost or fragmented, replaced by imported religious narratives that often conflicted with existing social and ecological knowledge. Communities that had once thrived under interconnected systems of spirituality, governance, and morality were forced to adapt to doctrines that prioritized hierarchical, male-centered authority. The result was not only spiritual disorientation, but also a diminishment of cultural resilience, creativity, and ethical frameworks rooted in balance and reciprocity. Moreover, the psychological impact of this erasure is still felt today. When ancestral deities and sacred knowledge are removed, people lose reference points for understanding their place in the world and the cycles of life, death, and nature. The suppression of African spiritual heritage contributed to the undervaluing of local knowledge, eroded cultural pride, and reinforced narratives that positioned indigenous beliefs as inferior. Recognizing the impact of this erasure is crucial for reclaiming spiritual and cultural heritage. It allows us to understand the depth of what was lost, appreciate the sophistication of pre-colonial African belief systems, and reconnect with the principles of balance, justice, and divine wisdom embedded in the worship of the hidden God. By confronting this history, we can begin to restore the voices, symbols, and teachings that were silenced, and reclaim a connection to ancestral divinity that is both empowering and transformative. The rewriting of history has long been a tool to control perception, and nowhere is this more evident than in the erasure of African spiritual memory. Centuries of colonial and religious intervention systematically suppressed indigenous African religions, demonized ancestral deities, and replaced rich spiritual traditions with imported narratives. This was not simply an act of religious conversion. It was a deliberate attempt to erase memory, reshape identity, and enforce a hierarchy that positioned European doctrines as superior. African gods and goddesses, once central to life, justice, and moral guidance, were dismissed as superstition. Sacred rituals, oral histories, and temples were obliterated, leaving behind a fragmented cultural record. This erasure went hand in hand with spiritual racism, portraying African spiritual systems as primitive or inferior, while simultaneously validating European religious authority. Communities lost not only their connection to the divine but also the frameworks that had governed ethics, governance, and harmony with nature for generations. The consequences of this historical rewriting are still felt today. Many people remain unaware of the sophisticated, holistic spiritual systems that once guided African civilizations. Knowledge of the hidden god, fertility goddesses, and other deities exists only in fragments, passed down in myths or obscured rituals. The suppression of this heritage undermined cultural pride, disrupted ancestral continuity, and imposed a sense of inferiority that has taken centuries to challenge. Recognizing this erasure is essential to reclaiming African spiritual memory and confronting the ongoing legacy of spiritual racism. By uncovering the stories, symbols, and teachings of pre-colonial Africa, we can restore a connection to ancestral wisdom and celebrate the depth, complexity, and resilience of African spirituality. History is not merely what was written. It is what was remembered, preserved, and lived. By acknowledging what was intentionally erased, we begin to reclaim the truths and sacred knowledge that colonial forces sought to bury. For centuries, the spiritual voices of African civilizations were silenced, distorted, or erased by colonial and religious powers. Temples were destroyed, sacred texts were burned, and rituals were forbidden. This suppression not only removed deities like the hidden god and fertility goddesses from public consciousness, but also fractured communities' connection to ancestral wisdom, morality, and holistic living. Reclaiming these silenced voices is not merely an act of historical recovery. It is a profound spiritual revival that restores identity, pride, and connection to the divine. The process of reclaiming begins with uncovering what was deliberately hidden. Scholars, historians, and spiritual leaders delve into fragmented oral traditions, archaeological evidence, and surviving rituals to reconstruct the beliefs and practices of ancient African civilizations. By doing so, they reveal the sophistication of African spirituality, a system that harmonized body, soul, and nature, emphasized moral responsibility, and celebrated the divine in every aspect of life. Reclaiming silenced voices also requires acknowledging the human cost of suppression. Spiritual and cultural erasure disrupted not only religious practice but also social cohesion, ethical frameworks, and ecological understanding. Communities lost access to guidance systems that had ensured balance, justice, and sustainability for generations. By restoring these teachings, modern practitioners reconnect with principles of harmony, respect, and ancestral wisdom that transcend time. This revival is not just academic, it is living and experiential. Rituals, ceremonies, and symbols are revived in ways that resonate with contemporary life, fostering a spiritual connection that is personal, communal, and culturally rooted. People rediscover the hidden god, ancestral deities, and sacred practices, integrating them into daily life to regain empowerment, clarity, and spiritual fulfillment. Ultimately, reclaiming the silenced voices of Black spirituality is an act of resistance, remembrance, and restoration. It honors ancestors, revives lost knowledge, and asserts that African spiritual heritage is not a relic of the past, but a living, evolving system of wisdom. By reconnecting with these voices, communities reclaim agency over their spiritual narratives and reaffirm that the divine, as understood by their ancestors, remains accessible, relevant, and profoundly transformative. For centuries, African spiritual practices such as Orisha's worship, Vodun, and other indigenous rituals were systematically misrepresented and demonized by colonial powers and missionary forces. These sacred traditions, which had guided communities for generations with profound wisdom, moral frameworks, and spiritual connection, were painted as evil, witchcraft, or satanic, to justify their suppression. The deliberate distortion of these practices served not only to undermine African spirituality, but also to impose foreign religious and cultural hierarchies. Orishas, deities embodying natural forces, morality, and human guidance, were reduced to caricatures of superstition. Vodun, a sophisticated spiritual system with intricate rituals connecting ancestors, nature, and divine forces, was labeled as dark magic. Communities practicing these faiths were marginalized, often persecuted, and their sacred sites desecrated. What had been a source of life, healing, and ethical guidance became falsely associated with malevolence, eroding cultural pride and spiritual confidence. This demonization was not random. It was a calculated tool of control. By framing African rituals as dangerous or inferior, colonial and religious authorities sought to replace indigenous systems with monotheistic doctrines that reinforced their dominance. Spiritual leaders were targeted, rituals were outlawed, and the transmission of ancestral knowledge was interrupted, leaving entire communities spiritually disoriented. Yet, despite these efforts, the resilience of African spirituality persisted. Oral traditions, clandestine practices, and syncretic adaptations ensured that the wisdom of the Orishas, Vodun, and other rituals survived, often hidden in plain sight. Today, reclaiming and understanding these traditions allows a re-evaluation of what was lost and the recognition that African spirituality was sophisticated, ethical, and deeply connected to the human and natural world. By confronting the historical demonization of these practices, we can restore their rightful place in spiritual history, honor their integrity, and recognize the ingenuity and resilience of African communities that preserved these sacred traditions against centuries of systemic suppression. The question of whether humanity worships the true God or a manufactured deity challenges the very foundation of faith. Across centuries, spiritual traditions have been shaped, altered, and often controlled by powerful institutions, particularly during the spread of monotheistic religions. African spiritual systems, with their hidden god and pantheon of deities, offered holistic understanding, moral guidance, and direct connection to the divine. These gods and goddesses were deeply embedded in everyday life, bridging body, soul, and nature. Yet, through historical intervention, much of this spiritual wisdom was suppressed, replaced with doctrines designed to consolidate authority and reshape belief. The concept of a manufactured God emerges when divine narratives are constructed or modified to serve political, social, or cultural agendas. When ancestral deities, fertility goddesses, and moral frameworks of African civilizations were erased or demonized, a new narrative was imposed, one that often emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and centralized authority over holistic understanding, communal responsibility, and spiritual harmony. Yahweh, as presented in certain historical contexts, can be seen as part of this larger restructuring of spirituality, reflecting the priorities of institutions rather than the lived ancestral experience of divinity. This raises a critical reflection. Is the God we worship truly beyond human constructs? Or are we following a version carefully curated and imposed upon us? Recognizing the distinction requires reconnecting with suppressed spiritual systems, exploring the wisdom of African deities, and understanding the principles of justice, morality, and creation that existed long before. The spiritual landscape of Africa was once vibrant, deeply connected to the rhythms of nature, ancestors, and the divine. The hidden god and other ancestral deities were living forces, dynamic, responsive, and present in every aspect of life. These gods were not distant or abstract. They guided communities in morality, governance, justice, and harmony with the natural world. Spiritual practices celebrated human connection to the cosmos, emphasizing the unity of body, soul, and environment. Life itself was seen as sacred, and every action carried spiritual significance. In contrast, Europe's doctrinal god, as propagated through colonization and missionary activity, emphasized hierarchy, dogma, and absolute obedience. This version of divinity often appeared distant, mediated through institutions, and removed from everyday experience. By imposing rigid moral codes and centralized religious authority, European doctrines undermined the fluid, experiential, and communal spirituality that African societies had cultivated for millennia. Ethical guidance became top-down, rituals were standardized, and local spiritual knowledge was suppressed or labeled heretical. The tension between these two expressions of divinity illustrates more than theological differences. It highlights contrasting worldviews. The living God of the ancestors was relational, inclusive, and responsive, integrating humans, nature, and the divine in a continuous flow of guidance and wisdom. Europe's doctrinal God, by contrast, often required conformity and submission, prioritizing institutional power over experiential spirituality. Understanding this contrast is essential for reclaiming spiritual heritage. It allows communities to recognize the depth, richness, and ethical sophistication of ancestral African spirituality, and to critically examine how imposed doctrines reshaped belief systems, cultural identity, and moral frameworks. By reconnecting with the living God of our ancestors, people can rediscover a spirituality that is intimate, empowering, and in harmony with life itself, reclaiming the sacred wisdom that was suppressed for centuries. This awareness does not reject other forms of divinity, but encourages discernment. Understanding the difference between lived, relational spirituality and imposed, doctrinal constructs. It is a call to reclaim agency over spiritual perception and to honor the ancestors' enduring connection to the divine. Understanding the hidden God, African spiritual systems, and the historical erasure of ancestral deities is not just an academic exercise. It has profound relevance for the present. For centuries, the suppression of African spirituality has shaped perceptions of divinity, morality, and cultural identity. Communities were disconnected from the ethical frameworks, communal guidance, and holistic wisdom that had once structured life, leaving generations spiritually disoriented and culturally fragmented. Today, reclaiming this heritage is essential for rebuilding a sense of identity, pride, and spiritual agency. The lessons of history reveal the consequences of spiritual and cultural erasure. Societies that lost connection with ancestral wisdom often struggled with disconnected moral frameworks, environmental exploitation, and disempowered communities. By understanding the depth and sophistication of African deities, fertility goddesses, and the hidden God, we can reclaim a model of spirituality that integrates body, soul, and nature. This awareness fosters ethical responsibility, environmental stewardship, and communal cohesion, showing that spiritual systems are not abstract doctrines but practical guides for living. Furthermore, reclaiming suppressed African spirituality challenges lingering narratives of inferiority imposed by colonial and religious interventions. It affirms that African civilizations possessed rich, dynamic, and sophisticated systems of thought that informed morality, justice, and cosmology long before external doctrines arrived. Recognizing these contributions restores dignity, reinforces cultural continuity, and empowers communities to reconnect with ancestral wisdom. In a modern world, increasingly searching for meaning, understanding these suppressed spiritual systems encourages critical thinking, personal reflection, and informed faith. It also highlights the importance of questioning narratives that have been shaped by power, politics, and cultural bias. By reconnecting with the spiritual legacies of African ancestors, individuals and communities can reclaim agency, restore cultural pride, and foster a spirituality that is authentic, empowering, and deeply rooted in human experience. Ultimately, this matters today because it is a call to remember, restore, and act. It challenges us to reclaim what was lost, honor the ancestors, and ensure that the divine, as experienced and understood by African civilizations, continues to inspire, guide, and shape our world. 17. Forgotten Black Gods. Before Yahweh, long before the rise of Yahweh as the central figure in monotheistic religions, African civilizations worshipped a rich pantheon of black gods and goddesses. These deities embodied creation, justice, fertility, wisdom, and the intricate balance of nature and society. They were not distant or abstract. They were living forces actively engaged in guiding humanity, shaping moral frameworks, and ensuring the continuity of life. Their presence permeated every aspect of existence: rituals, governance, agriculture, art, and social structures, creating societies deeply in tune with the cosmos. Over time, however, these powerful deities were systematically forgotten. The expansion of monotheistic religions, particularly under the influence of colonial and ecclesiastical powers, sought to replace these African gods with a singular, male-dominated deity. Temples were destroyed, oral traditions were suppressed, and sacred texts were rewritten or lost entirely. This intentional erasure not only diminished knowledge of the deities themselves, but also fractured the communities that had thrived under their guidance. Practices that honored the cycles of life, death, and nature were recast as superstition, and the wisdom embedded in these spiritual systems was dismissed or vilified. The forgotten black gods represent more than lost religious figures. They symbolize the erasure of an entire worldview, one that integrated spirituality, ethics, and community life. These deities offered a model for living that emphasized reciprocity, justice, and the sacred connection between humans and the natural world. By losing this knowledge, successive generations were cut off from ancestral wisdom, cultural pride, and a holistic understanding of the divine. Today, rediscovering and honoring these forgotten gods is essential for reclaiming spiritual heritage and cultural identity. It involves studying surviving myths, rituals, and historical records to piece together the profound knowledge of African civilizations. Recognizing the forgotten black gods before Yahweh is an act of restoration, an opportunity to reconnect with the wisdom, morality, and cosmic understanding that guided humanity long before monotheistic doctrines were imposed. Reclaiming these gods is not only an act of historical justice, it is a step toward understanding a more inclusive, dynamic, and authentic vision of spirituality, one that honors the depth and resilience of African heritage. The journey through the hidden God, African deities, and the erasure of ancestral spirituality reveals a story long suppressed but not forgotten. These gods, goddesses, and sacred practices shaped civilizations, guided morality, and connected humanity to the cosmos in ways that modern doctrines often obscure. By understanding this history, we uncover not just forgotten faiths, but a deeper awareness of identity, culture, and spiritual connection. Curiosity becomes a tool of reclamation. Ask questions, explore myths, examine rituals, and seek the wisdom embedded in African spirituality. Every symbol, story, and deity holds lessons that challenge the narratives imposed by history and invite personal reflection. Reconnecting with these voices is not about rejecting all that followed, but about rediscovering truths that were silenced. The hidden God and the forgotten pantheon beckon, an invitation to awaken, explore, and reclaim the sacred knowledge that once guided our ancestors. The hidden God before Yahweh. Church tried to erase him.